The must draft stacks of 2025 to help you win big in fantasy football tournaments, best ball tournaments, fantasy football redraft leagues, whatever way you want to play it. But of course, we are looking here today with more of an eye to best ball and how you can exploit where these players are going, be able to put the jigsaw pieces together, and why they are the teams that can help supercharge your roster to win best ball tournaments this season. I am joined by Tom Strachan. Of course, mentioned in the show we did previously. Earlier this week, we talked a little bit through looking at 5 players that you should avoid drafting this season. I thought it was an interesting conversation. Some that we may have went back and forth on. Agreed, I think, on the majority of them. So check that one out if you haven't done so already. Tom, before we get into the stacking today, I think that we should lean into some of the information you were putting up on social media over the last couple of days, and I was a little bit intrigued by. I thought might have to add this into the conversation. Zero RB over the years has evolved quite a bit over the last decade. People were obviously not implementing it at all, and it's got more popular over the last couple of years. But if we look, even last year being probably the strongest usage for it, but it has grown a lot over the last 4 years. But because maybe people didn't have the success, maybe even didn't implement the entire builds the way that we would recommend to do it. But I think that that's going to mean that there's going to be a drop off in people using it in 2025. So let me know what you found, and then let me know if you think that makes it an optimal year to try and build out some zero RB rosters in these tournaments.
Yeah, so I mean, this all started because I was writing Fantasy Pros Zero RB kind of article looking back at 2024 and then further, which is an article I update every year. And one thing which you can't do, in my opinion, when it comes to this is ignore the fantastic tool that you guys have, the RotoViz Roster Construction Explorer tool, which I spend an obscene amount of time just tinkering around in there, just playing with different permutations of stuff. And at one point during everything, it was like, well, we know that Zero RB was incredibly popular last year. Like, we saw so many wide receivers get drafted aggressively. 24 wide receivers were taken in the first 36 picks last year, only 11 running backs. And I was like, well, how many people were really doing pure Zero RB, which in my mind is no running back till round 6 at the earliest. I know some people will maybe knock it a round later. Some maybe even try to water it down and make it earlier. And I looked back using the roster construction tool, and you go back to 2021, and that number in Underdog's BBM was 4.3%. Then that number has steadily grown to 6% in 2022, 9.5% in 2023. Now, of course, that was the year which won people millions of dollars. So there was a lot of money being made with it. And then in 2024, 21% of people drafting in Best Ball Mania were using Zero RB builds, which is quite a massive number when you consider basically what a unpopular tactic it was for years. It was the contrarian, Sean's Twitter handle, the FF Contrarian, for things like this. And this has coincided with robust RB going from 14% in 2021 down to 2% last year. And
that was the more surprising thing, I think, for me, was how much of drop off there was from that side of things.
Yeah, and so I'm using the definition of your third running back before round 5. So basically 3 running backs through 4 rounds. And last year was the perfect year for that. That was the year which those builds absolutely smashed it. And Zero RB just got obliterated. You look back at 2022, and the advance rate for Zero RB builds with 4, 5, 6, 7 running back totals were all over 19% when we talk about 16.7% as the base rate. 2023, again, you had plenty of numbers over 21%. And then this year, 2024, there were just about none above 8.5%. So you're saying that basically if you drafted Zero RB, no running back till round 6, it was twice as difficult for you to make fantasy playoffs on Underdog. So It really was the worst tactic at the worst time. And I think we have to kind of take the L and say, the draft board wasn't giving us good rooms for Zero RB. Now, it doesn't mean you couldn't build a good Zero RB team. There were still Zero RB teams that did okay in various points last year. But on the whole, it was so wide receiver thirsty last year that it made life incredibly difficult. And then the other part of this is that for years, one of the arguments in favor of zero running back has been wide receivers tend to stay healthier than running backs. Well, over the last 3 years, there's been a steady trend change that, like, when you're talking about players in the top 50, we've seen wide receivers go from playing 13.9 games per year steadily downtrended to 13.04. Meanwhile, running backs, when are pretty much staying stable. Last year, they got 13.5. The year before, it was 13.9. So running backs have actually overtaken wide receivers in the top 50 for the amount of games they're playing. That obviously isn't going to happen every year. And when it corrects, it could be exponential levels of chaos, really. You know, if we have the amount of running backs who are going in the top 2 rounds at the minute, you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 currently on Underdog.
Yeah, 10 on the FFPC.
Exactly. So if you get 2 or 3 injuries there, which obviously we don't want, that's not what we're wishing for, but it's hard to avoid injuries completely. And on a year where the rookie running back class is so highly desirable, yes, you've got guys like Ashton Genty, you've got Quinshon Judkins, Trevion Henderson, all going in the rounds where typically for zero RB, we might not be looking at them. But there's so many rookie running backs later that it feels like this could be the time to go back to zero RB, because if people are scared of using it, then we should be ready to embrace it again. And I know I won't have to convince you.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to have to pitch too hard. But some of the interesting things there, you know, and not to just say like, you know, robust running back isn't going to work. Historically, it hasn't. But hero RB, for example, is something that, you know, you can see there in the rates in terms of how popular it has become. And even it was something, you know, 5-6 years ago that, you know, people had to be really talked into drafting only one running back in those early rounds.
Yeah.
But when we look at like round 1, we have Saquon, we have Christian McCaffrey. Round 2, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Josh Jacobs. Like, you're in that veteran tier as well, where injuries happen, but also fall offs in performance can happen at that particular, you know, access of career trajectory as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But I do think that the landscape is set up for, you know, to lean in again. And I think a lot of the people who did try last year because of some successes that we talked about in 2023, I think they'll potentially, you know, drop off the bandwagon. But I do, where do you see it landing in terms of the overall percentage? You mentioned, you know, last year being 21.1%. I probably think that we probably close to half that. I think in the kind of 11 to 13 range probably is where we probably fall.
12% is the number I keep coming back to. And yeah, because so if you say in 2023, it was 9.5%. Like, particularly on Underdog, which is a wide receiver heavy platform, and still is, you know, there's more wide receivers being drafted in the top 100 players over there this year than there was even last year, despite the lack of success. So I think we can still say there's a desire to go zero RB. But yeah, I'd be surprised if it's much above or much below 12%.
The other thing it's very hard to, when we look back last year, there was obviously a lot of things in a kind of a perfect storm. You mentioned the wide receiver injuries. We had some of the running backs at the top end, like, absolutely crushed throughout the course of the season. Some of the veteran running backs, the likes of a Josh Jacobs or Joe Mixon, that had really strong, you know, performances throughout certain parts of the year as well. But the other part is, like, when we look at 21% of these teams being drafted using zero RB, it almost, and it felt like this at points last year, it almost made it suboptimal because quarter of the field was nearly like a fifth of the field is using that. So when you're in those draft rooms, it was making it a lot trickier. We talk about wide receiver avalanches and so on, just made it challenging. Whereas in previous years, you're drafting against people who have no interest in doing, you know, what you're doing. And it means that the targets that you want to have at certain points of the draft are much easier to put together that overall roster construction. So I think that is something that we haven't fully factored in, that maybe your information showing here that because it became so popular, it made it a little bit trickier to optimally build those lineups.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And the thing is, like, if we went back in time a year ago and we're given the information, only 2.4% of people are going to draft robust RB builds. How many robust RB teams would you have had as your part of your portfolio?
Yeah, to try and get some leverage on it as well. Even though it's something we don't want to do, but certainly adding up and getting some more of those additional running backs would have been definitely a way to play it. Because you mentioned the contrarian element, and there is part of that as well to try and do what people aren't doing. But yeah, I'm definitely going to be on board this year. I think, this is a perpetual statement. I'll be on board every year for zero RB drafting. But let's get into the other topic at hand, and that is the stacks that are going to help people win in 2025. I'm going to pull up the FFPC ADP. We'll use that while we're talking through. You might reference Underdog for some of these, but no matter what the playing platform, the players are kind of generally going in similar areas of drafts. But who is the team? Doesn't have to be in order for this one, but who's the team you want to talk about first as a great stacking opportunity to leverage against the field here?
Well, one of my favorites is the Titans, who, let's be clear, they firmly understood that they needed to upgrade upon Will Levis. And part of that came down to the fact that they had the second worst turnover margin per game last year. It's hard to consistently score points when you've got somebody like Will Levis who's coming up with all kinds of creative
He
ways
threw
to
some
get
of
the
the
ball over.
picturesque interceptions of all time last season.
Just
It'll never be
absolutely.
repeated.
I mean, when you're sitting there on a Sunday evening for us or Sunday afternoon for our friends across the pond, and you're watching Red Zone, and then you scroll through Twitter and it is just a sea of Will Levis memes. Like, that's what we're after on a Sunday in some regards. But the Titans now have a chance to improve from being the team who were third bottom in red zone scoring attempts per game, played the ninth fewest plays per game. And Cam Ward, I think, looked NFL ready to me. I think that the Titans have done the right thing in terms of bulking up the offensive line. We know we've got a good offensive line coach there in Tennessee. And the AFC South, I said previously that maybe they can improve as a division this year, but it's still not the most imposing. And I think that between Calvin Ridley, who obviously you would have to pay up for, in sort of like the fifth round area, and then Tyler Lockett much later in the draft. It's quite a good veteran savvy room. And then you've got guys who you can be taking shots on, like Elic Ayomanor, Chig Okonkwo, even Tyjae Spears is a nice cheap piece, and Tony Pollard. So I like stacking Cam Ward with any of those guys. And I don't feel like when I draft Calvin Ridley that I have to have the Titans stack, but it just gives me a nice out 9-10 rounds later to be able to take the quarterback and add that correlation.
Yeah, the one thing I like about stacks like this is you can set them up and you're not having to force them. I much prefer stacks where you're able to take, the wide receiver and then take the quarterback as you fill out the roster at the back end. So Cameron Ward is going as the quarterback 26 in FFPC drafts in the 14th round. I'm still trying to figure out exactly why, in a situation where he should be the undisputed starter here as we start the season, that he lands in that part. Obviously, you can get into potential weaker weapons. You mentioned Calvin Ridley. He's going as the wide receiver 36 in the 7th round. I do think that there's a strong possibility at this point that Tyler Lockett's race is run in terms of what he's going to do on the upside case. And I would much rather go the direction of Chig Okonkwo and the rookie there as well. I just think that he has a little bit more upside, and I do like Tyjae Spears going in the 11th round. But I think that being able to, Calvin Ridley is not going to be one of my prime targets this year, but if it's a case that you do take him and you can get a cheap stack at the back and then be able to add in additional pieces as you work your way through it, I think that's interesting. I'm not going to be as excited here on the Titans, Tom, as I think you are. But the part that I find interesting in this is I touched on it on the last show, and I said some of these teams that are not interesting now are teams that, at the end of the season, people will be like, how do we not see that coming? How do we not see that success happening? And previous years, when Jared Goff went to the Lions, people didn't want Jared Goff or the Lions with Geno Smith, and Geno Smith probably fits this role again, apart from the fact that his young playmakers are going very early in drafts. But, teams that people don't want a part of, and then they have this explosion in the offseason, and then you're getting them at these very reduced prices. What makes it interesting. I'm going to bounce on to pick. I know the teams that you've obviously picked, you've shared them with me, but I do think all of these next three, I'm going to let you pick which one you want to go with. I think all of these three, though, I find very interesting for this season.
So let's stick with the theme of paying up for one receiver early and then kind of being able to wait a while and go Carolina Panthers. Like on underdog, you take Tet in round 4, and then you've got a 10-round wait before you get to the next kind of part of the traditional stack. Yes, Chuba Hubbard goes round 5 over there, but then Bryce Young 1405, Adam Thielen 1407, Xavier Legette 1403. Like the Panthers, even if you miss out on Ted McMillan, these are one of those ones where you can look at your roster and say, I don't have a stack. I don't have enough stacks right now. And we know the work that Mike Leone's done around stacking proves that if you have 6 to 9 players on your roster who are game stacked, you increase your expected win rate by up to 35%, which is pretty good if you ask me. So being able to backdoor a stack of the Panthers, who really improved as the season went on last year, to the point where the CJ Stroud versus Bryce Young conversation has completely kind of flipped almost at this point. And I just really like buying in on this offense. I think that the coaching staff know what they want to do with Bryce Young now. I think that with Adam Thielen, you've got a guy who, yes, definitely on the back 9 of his career, probably on the back 3 holes at the very
he's on the
best.
18th screen.
But he has those weeks, particularly in full PPR, where he just pops up for him. Ted McMillan is exactly the kind of wide receiver who Bryce Young needed. Xavier Legette looked okay. And, you can even say Jalen Coker further down if you want to take a complete dart throw on somebody. And I like Jatavian Sanders as well. So there's just no real negatives for me at the costs.
Yeah, and a lot of these players too for the Panthers outside of Thielen are younger players who could make that step up and take a leap there. The other thing is that the quarterback play that we've seen, like I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like the way the first year and a half of Bryce Young's career has started. Like think back to last offseason, he's benched basically for Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton has a car crash during the season, and then Bryce Young comes in and just looks fantastic down the stretch. And I would like often take shots over the last kind of 2 years or so at Adam Thielen, and that he's beyond his best. But I think a huge amount of credit has to go specifically to him for this turnaround, because he made some catches that other wide receivers on this roster wouldn't make, which obviously enhanced some of the confidence for Young. But like you look at McMillan, who you mentioned, wide receiver 23 in round 5, he's going in an interesting tier there with Devontae Smith, Zay Flowers, like we talked about Jameson Williams on the previous show. But I think McMillan is the wide receiver here who is set up to, I'm not going to say like Malik Nabers in terms of talent, but that role of like, let's give him, these short passes that he's just going to rack up some bonus PPR points, basically long handoffs. And then that's going to give him that floor, but he also can have the upside and the ceiling as the season goes along. And the way you compare him and Thielen, who you mentioned him in the 15th round, Bryce Young in the 13th round. And then I think that if all things go well for McMillan and Thielen, does pretty good to above average this season, I do think that our boy Coker mightn't get to see it all through here. But there is a number of ways you can play it. I think that all of those guys would be my priority ahead of Legette. But I think that along with Jatavian Sanders, who's tight end 31 over at the FFPC, you can build out a lot of upside for low cost. And that's the kind of stack that I want to do. I don't want to be putting a lot of draft capital and allocation into, the first 10 rounds, trying to stack a team up, trying to force those stacks together. This is one where you can kind of McMillan's a priority target. You take him, then you work your way through the draft, and you're like, my QE3 can be Bryce Young, and you can work out the rest of it from that perspective. But for how good Young was down the stretch, you have to also factor in how bad he was prior to that. But him being the QB 24, I think, again, is a strong value. Him, Ward, and Geno Smith are all going there in an area of the draft where I think they all should be going higher. I think some of the lower kind of quarterback window guys are too inexpensive, I'm going to say, which means you can exploit it in your drafts this season. Next up, Tom, let's go with the Texans, because you mentioned CJ Stroud.
Yeah,
you tell me the positive, because I don't want to. I'll rip off of my thoughts after.
Well, I've racked on CJ Stroud plenty, and I thought his ADP last year was the most egregious one on the board. It just seemed so obvious that for a player who in his first season had only, it was 2 25-point games, or sort of like had rarely been a top fantasy deliver, delivered in a way for fantasy, and then it felt kind of obvious that he wasn't suddenly going to become this elite quarterback. But I think there's been too much of an overcorrection, and we often see this in fantasy football, don't we? Like, and now he's what, QB 19 on FFPC, and he goes at an ADP of 133rd on Underdog. Again, this is one of those stacks where you're paying up for Nico, and then you don't pay up for anything for a while. You've got Jayden Higgins at round 9, then you've got Christian Kirk in the 11th round on Underdog. You've got Jalen Noel in the 13th round, and you can add in Dalton Schultz there as well. And I just think all of those prices are quite nice. I think that what we're seeing from the Texans, well, what we expected from the Texans to what we got in the draft was so different. They lost Laramie Tunsil. They traded him away to the Commanders due to personnel stuff. And this offensive line, which ranked 29th according to PFF last year, still doesn't have a Pro Bowl left tackle. They're probably going to be worse. And they just seem to be taking the Bengals approach. Defense, bad. O-line, bad. Screw it. We're just going to throw the ball a lot. And they had the 10th most dropbacks last year. I don't think that the defense is suddenly going to become so elite that we don't see the Texans passing a lot. And I think that they're going to struggle to run the ball. And it's just going to be pass-centric, and it's going to be Nico, it's going to be Jayden Higgins, it's going to be Christian Kirk at times, and maybe Jalen Noel later in the season.
Yep.
And the overcorrection's been too much.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to be quite concentrated, and I agree with. I think the Joe Mixon regression as the season went on was obvious, and I think I've mentioned this a lot. Between them and the Packers leaning so heavily in the run game was at the detriment of the team in general. I've pulled up here his stats from that rookie season. He was a QB1 60% of the time, a QB2 33% of the time. So he only had one bad game basically that entire season, which as a rookie is obviously extremely impressive. But when we go to last year then, and you're talking about the numbers here overall, like it wasn't a case that he was like, some of the eye test was very bad in terms of missed plays and opportunities left out there and touchdowns that he didn't complete. But when we look, like he was QB1 just 12% of the time. That's the big concern. But 59% of the time QB2. He just wasn't given any ceiling. He was, in that kind of 16 to 20 points every week. And then he had 29% of the time down at QB3 or worse. But I also think that the team, like this is a not a make or break, but like if he wants to be a legitimate long-time franchise quarterback, he needs to get back closer to what he was the year prior. And we did just see a situation where a QB who came in and like stunk the joint up for 18 months, then now is somebody who we're excited about and young after how he came on at the back. And so like this can be turned around, I think, pretty sharpish, but he has the pieces and the players around him now. He also had a tough environment. Like Dell comes in, he's injured to start the season, and Dell out later in the year with a horrific injury. But you get Stephon Diggs tears his knee up. Like the whole thing.
Nico missed a bunch of games to start the season as well. Yeah, Nico
started off pretty well, but then like gets that hamstring injury, catching a deep touchdown. I remember that very specifically because he was on a main event roster that I had. But when you look at it, I think the team is set up in a nice environment. Now, you do have Nico, who will be a player I'll be targeting this year as the wide receiver 8. But like, I think, again, talking back to some of the rookie drafting over the last couple of weeks, Jayden Higgins for me was one of my priority targets, happily drafting him above ADP at the end of the first round. So have him in a lot of situations. And, you get down then to Christian Kirk, who is somebody who, although he was vastly overpaid by the Jaguars, still, like if you're having him as your wide receiver 2/3, that's a player who can really deliver as a veteran at the NFL level. So I think all across the board, the Texans are set up pretty nice. And as I mentioned, even though we're mentioning like this, possibly going down to Jalen Noel, I think it's going to be quite concentrated around those 4 receivers. And basically Noel, I think, comes into play if one of the other guys is hurt. But I think it's a condensed offense with where the targets are going. I don't really see Schultz getting all that much involved. I know Joe Mixon's going to siphon off some targets, but the Texans set up pretty nice and also pretty attainable outside of the top guy. And again, it's another cheaper quarterback option to add to your roster as well. The last team you've marked down here to talk about is the New York Football Giants. And of course, I'm sure that the reason you're stacking this up is you're excited to draft for Russell Wilson. Is that right?
It's definitely not. It comes down to a cheap QB here. So it's like, again,
Who are you betting on? Are you betting on Dart or are you betting
I'm
on
betting on Dart,
James?
yeah. I mean, you look at the OTAs and he was splitting reps with Russell Wilson. Like, if they really didn't have any faith in him, then you look at teams like the Browns where Shadur Sanders is playing fourth fiddle. So
Yeah.
I think that the Giants need that win. I think that they feel pretty good about Jaxson Dart. I think with this coaching staff, with Brian Dable, Joe Shane, these are guys who've been around dual threat quarterbacks to differing levels. But Jaxson Dart had at least 560 rushing yards in each of his last 3 years in college. So I think that the floor elevates because of that. Wan'Dale Robinson last year was 11th in receptions among wide receivers with 83. Darius Slayton consistently turns out to be one of the better values available late on in best ball drafts. Theo Johnson is somebody that I'm seeing more and more people start to just give a little bit of hype to, a little bit of expectation. And obviously, between Scadaboo, Tyron Tracy, I think you've got guys who can act as reasonable pass catching running backs as well. So there's just not particularly many reasons why I want to avoid this team, whilst also accepting that it is the Giants and they could quite easily stink. I think that you can be putting them in pass heavy situations plenty.
Yeah, I think they could be fighting and coming back from some tough situations like they were last year as well. But you factored in the pieces and the weapons that are going to be there if Dart's the starting quarterback. You did not mention Malik Nabers, who I think is also a good player who would certainly help Dart to put up some
Yeah.
fantasy points. As we've seen at the end of last season with Drew Lock having a massive game at that point. But I do feel like if you're building out that giant stack, you could do it, and try and go and get those cheaper options. But I really think you want it to be on those Malik Nabers rosters that you're getting Jaxson Dart later on. I do like Wan'Dale Robinson, who over the last couple of years, I'm sure we've drafted him a lot together, where I've probably pushed him on you, but Slayton fits into that category. We're not going to get all the plays, but we'll get some big plays along the way to boost up some of those weekly numbers. But the Giants are intriguing. But what makes the Giants intriguing and what makes Dart intriguing for me is the wide receiver for Malik Nabers.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, obviously all these stacks where you can take one guy early and then wait late for the rest of them, they're always going to be far better if you've got the wide receiver one to them. But I think that if you're just looking for pure correlations, there's little ones where I'm like, look, if I need my wide receiver 3 and I'm betting on a random outcome in week 15, 16, 17 to get me to the finals or get me to the money, then I'm willing to take these, even if I don't have those wide receivers at the very top.
Yeah, and I like as well getting the options here. We're trying to start them up with, like, we talked about Ward already, but like looking at where Dart is going in these situations, and I do expect that to come up as OTAs are going. He's going as the wide receiver 32 in the FFPC format in the 18th round. In terms of ADP, he's the second last quarterback that's registered on the RotoViz tools as, like, Daniel Jones is the QB 33, but like Dart, I think if you're drafting now is the time to add that in. I would expect him to be in, like, that 14th round range with Ward. I was talking about these guys at the back of the QB window, round 12, round 13 being too cheap. But like Jaxson Dart then is going like 5 rounds after those guys, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But you could also be in a situation where you don't have a QB, at the start of the season if they do go the Russell Wilson direction. But you're also looking at like building out this roster, and where the stacks really are going to matter is going to be in the playoffs particularly. And if you get into a situation where there's 4 weeks left in the season and he's your QB3, but now you're getting to pair him up with Malik Nabers, who's having a monster season, that's where that particular play at that particular very, very cheap cost at the moment becomes interesting. Any final thoughts, Tom, before we close out here on stacking in general, stacking in 2025? I guess, like, we've talked through stacks, and you've mentioned Leone's work and the advantages of it. Anything you want to?
Yeah, just I think like last year was a year where I leaned slightly into slimmer stacks, whereas there's been years where I've kind of gone heavy stacks and it hasn't always worked out for me. And last year there were some of the teams that I felt looked better than other ones were ones where I didn't go crazy with the stacks. Now, obviously, that means that if the team does go nuclear and everyone gets home, then you only have one piece of the offense and it might be the wrong one. But I think there were just a number of occasions where I was like, I'd rather have 3 stacks and make sure all 3 quarterbacks are stacked. And if I'm going to no more than 2 pass catches with each quarterback, I'm okay with that.
Awesome stuff. So we did a show earlier this week just to hype it one more time where we talked through some players, 5 in particular to avoid in 2025. Be sure and check that out if you haven't done so already. You can subscribe to the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast feed. Get all these shows once they are available. I've had on some great guests over the last couple of weeks. We had JJ Zacharyson on last week. We've had Pete Overzet, Pat Curran, and many, many more over the last couple of weeks. But we have lots of people lined up in the coming weeks as well. Justin Herzig will be on next week coming up. So make sure you are subscribed to get those once they're available. Of course, you can hear me and Sean Siegel on RotoViz Overtime as well. Subscribe and get those shows once they're available. Tom is over at the Fantasy Football Sanctuary. He's also over on Fantasy Pros. I know you did mention at the end of the previous show, Tom, but let the listeners know where they can check out more of your work over the coming weeks.
Yeah, well, I've been busy writing best ball articles for Fantasy Pros for the last month. There's our best ball guide is up there now. Loads of stuff where it's about zero RB, hero RB, historically how it's done, with a heavy dose of RotoViz's tools put into there to make those articles really pop. And then on Mondays, you can catch me on the Fantasy Pros Best Ball Show with Andrew Erickson. We draft on a bunch of different platforms. And then also on Mondays, myself and Tyler on the Fantasy Sanctuary draft, underdog drafts every single Monday with guests or by ourselves. So plenty of places you can catch me, and just always glad to be on here with yourself, Colm.
No problem. It's been a pleasure, Tom. Good to get to catch up, and we should try and not let it go as long. The next time before we do, you can follow Tom at NFL_T-Strack. I'm sure we'll have lots of best ball stuff with me and Tom over the course of the next couple of months. I'm sure it'll pop up from time to time. But until we are back, have a good one.